So in historical narratives, we said that the author can do several things. First, he has to be selective about the events that he wants to discuss. Even if he's chosen a historical time period to address, he's got to select either specific events within that historical time period or dimensions of that time period. The next thing is he can reorder those events, take them out of chronological order for several different reasons if he feels that that will make his point more efficiently. Finally, the last thing we're discussing here is the way the author communicates that information or presents it. The author can edit or nuance the story in a way that really tells the story he wants to tell or makes the point he's trying to argue. Let's take a look at what editing is, or how the author can do that. I've got an example here from 1 Samuel 24:1 compared to 1 Chronicles 21:1. Now, I've chosen these because these two different books written in two different time periods in history of Israel are written about the same event. You can see the difference in how these two different authors describe or nuance that event. They're both talking about David taking a census of Israel, and in both of these events, it is understood that what David was doing was a sin. It was not good, but there is a difference in how they present that information. Let's take a look at 1 Samuel 24:1. Here it says that it was the anger of the Lord that burned against Israel, and really that it was the anger of the Lord that incited David against them to take the census. Now compare that to 1 Chronicles 21:1. It says that Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So on one hand, it's the Lord really that's seen as the motivator, and in the other, it's Satan. Now obviously there's a completely different perspectives on the same exact event. And I think this is a great example of how the author can nuance information or present the material in a way that makes his point. Now, just so that you can understand how that does impact each of these authors, in Samuel, the author is really trying to explain why the kingdom of Israel got conquered, and what happened was the northern 10 tribes of Israel would get conquered later on, and the last 2 tribes down south of Judah would be conquered by Babylon. But Israel as a whole nation would eventually become conquered by other nations. And so Samuel was written to look at the history of Israel and explain that the fact that Israel got conquered doesn't mean that Yahweh isn't powerful. In fact, what it does mean is that Yahweh allowed Israel to be conquered because Israel sinned against God. So Samuel, the entire 2 volumes of Samuel, were written from the perspective of explaining to the audience that Israel being conquered was Yahweh's punishment to Israel, and it's not proof that Yahweh is weak. Now, that's why in this case, in Samuel, it's the Lord burning against Israel, because the author is presenting the information, nuancing it in a way that really makes the point that Yahweh is in control, he is in fact powerful, and that Israel's destruction was a punishment, not necessarily a sign of Yahweh's weakness. Or not in fact a sign of Yahweh's weakness. Now let's move to Chronicles. Now here the difference is that Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. And so why would Satan be the one really motivating the census and not the Lord? Well, in Chronicles, this was written after Samuel, after Babylon conquered Israel, after Israel's been in exile for a number of years. Israel, the Jews are finally moving back to their homeland, and the point of the author, or what the author is really trying to communicate in Chronicles, is not, hey, you got punished because God wanted you to get punished, but really it's, even though you got punished, God is still going to be with you. God was patient with us before, he'll be patient with us again, and he'll be here to help us rebuild. So in Chronicles, the author's trying to take a much more positive view of God, And so he's going to try and distance God from the actual activity of the numbering of Israel. So that's why here in Chronicles, it's Satan stands up to Israel against Israel by moving David to number Israel. So you can see that the different emphasis in Samuel, it's really saying God is punishing us. He's not weak. We got conquered because God is punishing us. In Chronicles, the real motivation is, hey, yeah, God punished us, but look how good God is, and we can have confidence in Him now as we try and rebuild. And so the way they nuance or the way they word their stories is going to help make their point. Now, so here's the key. A lot of times, you just have to really carefully pay attention to the way things are worded, especially when it's not concrete data. So, for example, in the previous example, we saw that David numbered Israel and that it was wrong. Paying attention to maybe the extra information, like it was God that motivated him versus Satan that motivated, and being conscious of the point of view that the author has, or the lens through which he's viewing history, will a lot of times help you understand what the author's trying to say. And so really the goal here, what I'm suggesting you need to be doing when you're reading a historical narrative, is pay really close attention to how the author words his story. So just watch the nuancing. The next thing is that sometimes the author would add a tangential or peripheral or extra information that helps you illuminate the story. Maybe you're reading and the author will say something that kind of catches you off guard, like, why would he mention this? Or, that's strange. That's a strange detail that was added to the story. Usually the author is doing that because he's trying to keep the audience in perspective with what's happening. Like, for example, in the Gospels, I think it's in Mark, Jesus sends the disciples on a boat to cross the Sea of Galilee, and he walks on water to get out, and then he gets into the boat, and the scriptures say that the disciples were afraid, and it says because their hearts were hardened and they did not understand about the bread. Now that's kind of strange. It's a strange little tidbit of information there. What does bread have anything to do with Jesus walking on water? Well, if when you're reading the entire narrative, you come to understand that bread was a sign of who Jesus was, of his identity. And so since Jesus just walked on water and got in, and they didn't understand what Jesus was doing at that point, it's because they didn't know who Jesus really was. And so the author is adding some extra information to help you stay on track, to catch his point. So in that sense, in that little illustration, bread represents Jesus' identity in some weird way, and because the disciples didn't understand it, Jesus' identity, they didn't understand how he could walk on water. And so anyway, this is probably the hardest of all these questions to be asking yourself, but it's really pay close attention to how the author words things, and trying kind of amass an understanding of all the different nuances throughout the story and what the author is really trying to build through all of them.